The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 50. Agents and Ammunition. The Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army convened in the Great Hall. Linda had a tearful reunion with her daughter, who admonished the older woman for putting herself in so much danger at Gringotts Bank. Still, Hermione could not stay angry at her mother, particularly when she heard the brief version of the story of how Linda had helped destroy the cup, and how the cup had tried to make the woman think. There were surprisingly few casualties, likely in large part because of the nervous and jittery aims of the Death Eaters, who still had copious amounts of unhinged binge running through their bloodstreams, interacting rather deplorably with their magic. Remus Lupin and one of the Weasley twins had been badly injured, but were safe and on the mend, thanks to Madame Pomfrey and Linda. A few people had small lacerations or burns, as well as a handful of broken bones. One young fighter had been left for dead by Bellatrix, who had used a modified Sectum Sempra curse, but she had been found rather quickly and taken for healing. Her fate had been uncertain for a time, but she had turned the corner and was stable. Likewise, Severus Snape had been healed of his injuries from the overprotective Jugson. Dumbledore's army, plus the handful of sympathetic Slytherins, had gathered in the Great Hall with the rest of the crowd. Dumbledore was being greeted by cries of disbelief from every corner. Neville and Pansy were holding hands, seated by themselves at a table. Ron and Luna were organizing platters of food and drinks that several elves had magicked into the room for the fighters. Hermione and Draco were listening to stories of skirmishes from Theo, the twins, and several others. But there was a general sense of unease. Many of them had seen Harry Potter during the course of the battle. Some had even fought alongside him at moments. But the last two to have seen him, Sirius and his mysterious friend, did not know where he'd gone. "He was with us, just upstairs. We told him not to leave the castle, that it was dangerous, him being outside of the castle. Surely he didn't," Sirius said in anguish. Just then, a loud voice echoed through the room, tamping down their hubbub of voices into silence. "Harry Potter is with," the cold voice said. "What was that? Did you hear that? What did he say?" A frisson of anxious energy passed through the crowd. "That's you-know-who," Draco whispered nervously to Hermione and the others nearby. "Why does he sound like that?" Hannah Abbott asked in alarm. "I don't know," Draco answered, confused. Now the voice had changed, and instead of Voldemort, the voice that rang out was none other than Richard Granger. Hello, everyone. My cousin, the Dark Lord, wishes for me to inform you that, Harry Potter is dead." A gasp and a cry of horror and disbelief raced through the crowd. As one, every able-bodied person began moving to the doors, crowding into the entrance hall and spilling out into the grounds of Hogwarts Castle. Hermione, Draco, and several others were rooted to the spot, shock and pain clouding their faces. Tears began flowing down Hermione's cheeks. "He died trying to fight, but the Dark Lord was, too powerful. Therefore, it is our suggestion that you stow away your wands and prepare to join us. We will come together as one, because, well, we are the champions, my friends. We'll keep on fighting till the end. We are the champions. No time for losers, because we are the champions." Linda Granger turned to look at Tonks and Lupin as she pursed her lips. "He's nervous, but I think everything's all right. He only quotes song lyrics when he's in a good mood." But then her eyes fell on her daughter, who had collapsed to the floor at the news. She and Tonks rushed to Hermione. "It's going to be all right, love. Have some faith. You've done this all before." "Mum! Harry!" Hermione choked out. Draco knelt down and put an arm around her to pull her to him, his face a mask of worry. "Hermione, you've been involved in these plots before. You know what's happening," said a calm, knowing voice from nearby. "What? How?" the young witch asked, turning to look at Dumbledore, who had spoken as he approached. Draco stood, still confused, but reached down along with Linda to help Hermione up from the ground. "Is this some sort of trick, do you think? Is Potter still alive?" Draco asked Linda in a low voice. "Let's just go out and have a look round, shall we?" asked Linda. Outside, Dumbledore's army and the Order were gathered near the school entrance, whilst Voldemort's Death Eaters and several Snatchers hovered near the edge of the forest. In the far distance, a trombone sounded a warbling, ominous note. Harry was indeed lying at the feet of Voldemort, and he appeared dead. There were cries of disbelief and wails of sadness from the group near the castle. On the other side of the battle there was only the occasional menacing grunt, mainly coming from Greyback. As he did not have a dark mark, he had missed the earlier portion of the battle, and was anxious for his turn. To his benefit, he had also missed the sampling of Unhinged Binge earlier, meaning that he still generally had his wits about him, such as they were, unlike most of the others. Voldemort's wand was pointed at his own throat, but the first noises that emitted from it were nearly unintelligible, so he pointed his wand back at Richard to speak for him. Okay then." Richard cleared his throat and started again. "As I was saying, with Harry Potter dead, we think it best if everyone in the Order would just join forces and lay down their weapons. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one." Voldemort was growing more and more agitated, and finally removed the wand from the man's throat with a slight look of disgust at him. Instead, he turned the wand on Lucius. "Speak for me!" came the high, cold voice. "Yes, well, the time has come, as Richard was saying, for the fighting to end. As you see, Harry Potter is—" At this, Lucius gestured to the ground, but was as surprised as nearly everyone else to see that the boy was no longer lying there. A brief panic broke out. Voldemort's incomprehensible garble seemed to ask the question on everyone's mind. Where was Harry Potter? In the confused melee, the magical cage holding Nagini captive broke open, and the snake fell to the ground. She climbed swiftly up the side of her master, her head raised as though searching for the boy herself. At that moment, someone broke free from the crowd near the castle. "Neville!" An anguished cry went up from nearby. Hermione, Draco, and the others were shocked to see the figure of Neville Longbottom racing across the open expanse between the two groups, rushing headlong at Voldemort. His wand was drawn, and his eyes flashed fiercely, but despite Voldemort's temporary incapacity, it was still an uneven fight. In an instant, the younger wizard was on the ground, pinned by the non-verbal curse thrown at him. A few Death Eaters cackled at his predicament, having been there themselves more than once. As the rumblings of the Death Eaters grew, a lone voice, from the side of the Order rang out clearly, "Neville, catch!" Arcing high in the air was the sword of Gryffindor. It was freshly unsheathed from its pocket-book scabbard, where it had nestled amongst Augusta's collection of napkins, sweets, and her favourite lipstick. Now the sword flew upwards in an arc, then crested. It began its descent slowly at first, then quickly, hilt first. It flew swiftly towards the young man on the ground, who caught it deftly. Voldemort's pinning curse on Neville broke due to his surprise at the sudden intrusion of the woman with the sword. The young wizard jumped to his feet, gripping the sword in both hands and swinging it mightily, all in less than a few seconds. As the sword swung on its second upwards trajectory, this time controlled by Neville, all Voldemort could do was stare in shock as the head of his beloved snake parted company with its body. The garbled yell that tore past his numb lips could not form into intelligible words, even if he'd still had the power of proper speech. His lovely, his most loyal, his precious, his Horcrux, gone forever! But Richard was feeling nearly the same level of shock, because as the older woman's voice rang out, as her imposing vulture hat and signature red pocketbook swam into Richard's view, recognition overtook him, causing him to do a double take. "Vulture!" he whispered aloud. After all these years, it was hard to believe that it was possible. But it was her, he thought excitedly. Years before, when Richard was first recruited into MI6, he'd been assigned to a seasoned, long-time agent for training. She'd taught him everything he knew, but he had been certain it wasn't everything she knew. She'd put him through his paces, and they'd served on several missions, first with him as a junior agent, and her running the mission, then occasionally as co-agents. Then, as was sometimes the case within the ranks of the MI6, Vulture had vanished. It had happened not long after Hermione had come to them, Richard remembered. Vulture had been so excited, so proud to hear that Richard was becoming a father. She'd brought him a lovely, hand-stitched blanket for the baby, and had told him that her own son was expecting a baby soon. And then she was gone. As was typical in MI6 circles, little was said about it to the other agents that Vulture had worked with. By then, he himself was starting to take on fewer assignments due to his new little family. He'd only heard that Vulture had retired because of family issues. Richard had often wondered about the older woman, her son and grandchild, and what had happened to her. Apparently, judging from the pandemonium erupting around her, quite a lot had been happening in her life. The members of the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army seemed to take the snake beheading as the catalyst for attack. With a roar, they rushed as one towards the dwindling group of gathered Death Eaters. From behind Voldemort's followers, a booming drum beat announced the arrival of several additional fighters to join the Order of the Phoenix. They were led by a red-haired man who had to be a Weasley, and a rotund gentleman wearing green pajamas. They yelled as they came, and Richard thought wildly at first that they'd brought their own percussion section, but then he realized that it was only the giant's drums approaching from the forest. It appeared that, repelled from the forest by Voldemort's spell, the giants had finally at long last formed a band that now marched angrily towards them. And the marching band refused to yield. At the first trumpet blare, the fighters nearest the castle turned towards the safety of the building, with good reason. Between the stomping feet of the giants, and their loud, percussive accompaniment, the outdoors was no longer safe. One giant dropped a cymbal, and it fell with a vertical crash. It thudded with a harsh clang, neatly slicing in half the body of Antonin Dolohov, who had been attempting to stun the giant. At this gruesome and horrific sight, everyone raced towards the castle to take cover. Few of the Death Eaters made a move to fight. Those that did were vastly outnumbered. The sole exception was Fenrir Greyback, whose snarling, savage teeth snapped and frothed with spittle. His 4 wolf hands and feet covered the ground much faster than everyone else, but Richard had clocked him from nearly his first step. Still, the panicked and in some cases overly caffeinated crowd between him and the werewolf made it difficult to keep up. He looked to his left, more than a little surprised and pleased to see Lucius keeping pace with him. Just inside the castle doorway, Linda was trying to direct students into the great hall as Hermione tried to push her mother behind her body to keep her safe. The sight of Hermione must have been like that of a siren to the rabid creature. He sprang towards her, seizing her by the shoulders and knocking her wand to the side. From behind her daughter, Linda pushed futilely at the werewolf's gnarled fingers. Likewise, Draco rushed from across the corridor towards his witch, grabbing at the wolf's arms and shoulders. Fenrir shoved, scratching at Draco, then leaned his gleaming teeth over his prey. Richard finally reached the brute, looping his strong right arm around the werewolf's torso. He pulled, twisting to rip Greyback off his daughter. With an effort, he threw the pungent wolf to the ground. Instantly, the wolf launched himself up at Richard, yellowed eyes glowing incensed and greedy at the sight of the man who'd been so quick to annoy him over the last year. He leaped onto Richard, throwing him back to the ground, pinning down the Muggle man's strong arms with his sharp claws. With a speed and cognizance of which Richard was heretofore unaware, Lucius reached into the Muggle man's open jacket, finding the Walther PPK inside. He pulled, yanking it free of the holster. He appeared to look at it for a moment as though trying to decide which end did what task, but then came to a decision. He pushed the barrel of the gun into Fenrir's back and fired. In the tumult and frenzy of the battle, the gunshot made everyone pause in shock for a moment before resuming their stampede into the castle. Fenrir dropped onto Richard, dead, pinning him further to the floor. Draco and Lucius pulled him free and helped him to his feet. "Richard, I used your Jun," Lucius said, with the awe and wonder of a small child discovering a new toy. "Yes, thank you, Lucius, Richard began, but ducked quickly as Lucius waved the gun around haphazardly. "Let me have it back, please." He accepted it gratefully from the blonde wizard, re-engaging the safety and reholstering it swiftly. "I owe you a serious debt of gratitude, Lucius. I'm glad you had a view to a kill. Thank you." The 2 men grasped hands briefly, just as Narcissa appeared in the doorway of the great hall. "Everyone, this way!" The Grangers and Malfoys hurried with several others across the cavernous entrance hall. They entered the large room just as Harry Potter threw off the magnificent cloak of invisibility for a second time that night, to confront a wizard who was now mostly mortal. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great78.